Hello and welcome to the Amargi Mosaic. Today I'm really pleased to be joined by lecturer in global medieval history and Marxism, Dr. Nicholas Matheou, my friend Nick. Welcome to my show, Nick.
Thank you for having me, Elif.
So there's an attempt to carve up the Middle East once again. Turkey's Neo-Ottoman project reaches south and east, and Israel's Greater Israel vision encompasses, of course, Palestinian land and territory much beyond that too. We're seeing Gulf monarchies bankroll their own regional order, and behind all of it, Western powers pick winners. Overwhelmingly, throughout history and today, preferring fundamentalists and so-called strongmen over any experiment in genuine material democracy. We're told, or the narrative that is being pushed is that this is a new Middle East. But what I want to discuss with you today is, firstly, how new is it really? Because the peoples being crushed between these competing imperial projects, Kurds, Armenians, Assyrians, Yazidis, Palestinians, and others have seen this before. Their histories hold the patterns that we actually see today, and I can't imagine anyone better to discuss this with. So, as I said, we're watching two expansionist projects unfold simultaneously in the Middle East. Turkey's Neo-Ottoman project, or ambitions, and Israel's Greater Israel vision. On the surface, they look quite different in terms of scope, in terms of, kind of the motivation, the drive behind it. But one, one wraps itself in Sunni Islamic civilizational rhetoric, the other in ethno-nationalist logic. But the peoples being ground between them, the peoples that I've already mentioned, might see more similarities than differences. As a historian of how empires produce and actually eliminate peoples, what patterns do you recognize in these two quite significant visions that are being pushed upon the people of the Middle East and, broadly speaking, the borders and the shape of the Middle East? And yeah, what do you think these projects share, and actually what are different between them?
Thanks. It's a really important place to start with what is actually different. Because whilst there are new sort of ideological elements to the way in which the Zionist project and the Turkish nationalist project are articulating themselves, presenting themselves, and making claims. Not least that they're now seeing each other as rivals, or at least speaking as if they see each other as rivals. Really, these are two of the oldest allies in the Middle East. The Turkish Republic, still in its Kemalist phase before the sort of transition to relative multi-party democracy, was the first local regional state to recognize the state of Israel. And as the sole regional state to be part of NATO, it's long had incredibly close military ties as well as other economic ties. And this goes all the way into the 90s and into the 2000s. Really, the moment in 2010 when, if people remember, there was that attempt by some Turkish activists to break the siege in Gaza, and that boat was boarded, and that boat was then several people on that boat were then shot. That was the marker of a new period that really went against the grain of the long history of Turkish-Israeli cooperation. And of course, that extends also to the cooperation of the Mossad in the kidnap of Abdullah Öcalan in the late 90s. So I think it's really important that we ask how much is actually new in this situation, because those kinds of relationships don't just disappear overnight in 2010. They don't disappear over 15 years, or 16 years since then. I think what's new, as I mentioned, is the ideological framing. Kemalism, although it was always an imperial ideology and always an ideology that subordinated itself to wider imperial interests, and that's something we might come back to. Um, it didn't have as clear a expansionist logic. It didn't set out. It was quite a remarkable departure in 1974, for example, when Cyprus was invaded and the north of Cyprus was occupied, and that relates to changes in empire and the imperialist system at that point. Neo-Ottomanism sets itself up in a very different way. It sets itself up, at least on the surface, to reject the settlement that was reached at Lausanne in 1923 with the imperial powers following the so-called Turkish War of Independence, and to reclaim large portions of the region that had been part of the Ottoman realm and that were part of some claims to the kind of natural borders of Turkey following the First World War. So it's new in the sense that it really sees itself as an expansionist and as a restorating, a force for restoration. At the same time, the Zionist project has more continuity from its origins, even before the establishment of the State of Israel. There isn't anything that's a sort of equivalent to Neo-Ottomanism in sort of such a fundamental departure from the principles of Kemalism. At the same time, this idea of Greater Israel does speak to something that is likewise more expansionist, more explicitly expansionist than the main forms of Zionism had been, and an open declaration of everything between the river and the sea being part of the natural borders of Israel, and then a natural sphere of influence beyond the river and the sea as well. So I think what's new then in both of these is an acceptance at the level of the public sphere and the international community of expansionist projects in the Middle East. But what continues is the choice of the Turkish Republic and the Israeli state as empires, local men on the ground, to navigate the transition from one period of imperialist intervention to another, but whilst maintaining continuity of Turkey and Israel as the key local actors.
Mm. And I suppose one of the first places we're seeing this manifest, which in a way kind of does in the materiality of it, feels like, you know, history repeating itself, because one of the first places we're seeing this manifest is in Syria. You know, the Middle East after particularly World War One, the reshaping of the Middle East rather after World War One, as we know, more or less first started in Syria. So we're kind of seeing that today where, you know, both Turkey and Israel seem to be vying for spheres of influence in different parts of Syria. You know, Turkey seemed to be particularly interested in the north of Syria, and we can see that Israel is particularly interested in the south of Syria, and particularly the Golan Heights. So, you know, when we talk about obviously these visions, we talk about, you know, these spheres of influence, and what often gets lost in much of that conversation, right, is how minoritized nations are impacted in this, and in a way how they are made and unmade. And what I mean by that is, and I'm using minoritized very specifically because many of these communities and these nations are minoritized by, you know, by virtue of them, you know, for example, with the Kurds being divided into four nation states, the Kurds would not be a minority if they weren't divided into four nation states, right? And also other communities as well. So what does this particularly, I guess if we call it, like, if we look at the field of Syria, what does this tell us about how, firstly, how nations are minoritized and how they are the attempt to make and unmake them as well?
Yeah, it's great. It's another great question. I think we can see this very clearly in the historical period that you referred to, the end of really the height of the First World War and the period immediately afterwards. This is the moment where the Young Turk regime, the Committee of Union and Progress that was in power and the regime of the three pashas was in power in Istanbul, implemented a state building project. And that state building project is a particularly pronounced example of the kinds of processes that all nation states go through. Pronounced in the sense that it played out these processes in a really short space of time. On the one hand, it identified populations that can be assimilated to a majority identity. So that includes the Sunni and Turkish-speaking populations of Anatolia, as well as potentially other Sunni populations in Syria, in Mesopotamia. On the other hand, it identified populations that could not be assimilated to that majority population, and that especially includes Christians. Now, we're talking here in terms of religion, and many might think that it's much more important to talk in terms, many of your viewers might think it's more important to be talking in terms of ethnicity. But this is a period in which ethnicity and religion, the kinds of clear lines that we expect to see 100 years on from the imposition of the nation state form in this region, don't really exist to the same degree. And there are many communities still today that demonstrate that doesn't really exist to the same degree. There are still Armenian-speaking populations, the Hamshen population of the Pontus region, who exist within the borders of modern-day Turkey because they were Muslim. There are still Greek-speaking or Romeka-speaking populations in the same region in Pontus because they were seen to be assimilable. So the definition of Greek, Armenian, Assyrian wasn't based on the sort of cultural stuff that we associate with ethnicity, but was based above all on religion. So when this regime identified those populations, it began a process of assimilation on the one hand and extermination on the other. And minoritization is really the process of identifying populations that need to be treated through one of these two measures in order for the nation state project to be successful. And so the Armenian genocide then, as the most clear example of this, of course, what we refer to as the Armenian genocide also included Syrian speakers, also included Greek speakers, but did fall above all on the Armenian Christian population. Their entire trajectory from Anatolia took place through Syria and into the greater Syrian region, including Lebanon, including Palestine. And we see those same processes playing out again today at a point where the Turkish Republic, for example, has recognized that it cannot assimilate the Kurdish population. And so that becomes a population which could be exterminated. So these two moments feel very, very similar. 1914 to 1923 feels like one moment where the Middle East is being reshaped by imperial forces, and new populations are being minoritized and others are being identified for assimilation. And the same thing is playing out today, as we've seen in Afrin, in Serikanye, where the Sunni Arab population is being identified for assimilation, but the Kurdish population, which may also be Sunni, is being identified for minoritization and extermination.
I think that's actually a really, really interesting, kind of categorization that you've put out there. And I suppose another kind of thread that a lot of people have spoken about is, particularly in the past 100 years, there seems to have been a pattern that keeps repeating, also in parallel to this approach, but actually also quite integrated, which is whenever peoples in the Middle East build something or attempt to build something or seem to be in struggle to build something that looks like genuine material democracy, and this could be like sometimes policies or attempts that are not necessarily very large, radical, revolutionary attempts, from like land and currency reform to communal governance, women's liberation, resource sovereignty as well, particularly Western powers or their regional representatives, let's call it, just for the broad understanding, move to destroy it. We've seen this in many examples where they'll back fundamentalists, monarchists, military juntas, anyone over a functioning popular democracy. And we saw it with Mossadegh in Iran. We're seeing it with the autonomous administration in North East Syria. And we've seen it also in many revolutionary examples where, it seems like it's not a coincidence that, when there was some of the camps in the south of Lebanon where lots of different struggles were, basically training together, that there were multiple fascist coups in states around the region, right? And then therefore there was an attempt to move in and destroy those camps. One, because they needed to be destroyed, but some have suggested that they were destroyed precisely because that they were a space where people were cooperating and building something beyond their own immediate national interests as well. So, we're also seeing that, like many say, that Gulf monarchies, especially now, effectively operate as Western client states, managing the region's resources on terms set, either in Washington, London, Paris, or Berlin. So why, I guess this is a very broad question, but feel free to approach it in whatever way you like. But why does Western imperialism consistently prefer theocrats and autocrats over, democracy and democrats? And what is the history of that?
Yeah, it's a great point. And as you were speaking, the Bekaa example, the southern Lebanon, was the first thing that came to my mind. Um, there's an idea which a political scientist called James Scott developed when he was thinking about how states work in general, called legibility. What a state wants is a legible population. That is a population that it can read, that it can categorize, and that it can control. It doesn't want the kind of messiness of real life, where people have multiple senses of self, where people might speak a number of languages, where the real fabric of society is able to develop freely. And so I think in general terms, all states want to try to homogenize populations and to make them legible by giving them one characteristic. And that's what we've seen at the level of internationalism and multi-communal activism playing out across the second half of the 20th century. Of course, the context for many of these struggles is the kind of different movements broadly under the kind of international communist movement. We saw that in Cyprus, for example. There was a very strong, growing communist movement in the 50s in Cyprus that was very explicitly pan-communal in the region. It was very explicitly about having Muslims and Christians, Turkish, Greek, Armenian, Arabic-speaking Cypriots organizing together. And at the point at which that became a genuine threat in the late 50s to British control of what Churchill charmingly named the unsinkable aircraft carrier, which is a role that we've seen it play again in the recent genocide in Gaza. At that point, Britain, Greece, and Turkey, note no Cypriot representatives, got together and agreed a new form for the Republic of Cyprus. That form then lasted with severe problems up until 1974, at which point the president, Archbishop Makarios, who no archbishops, so this is a tendency towards theocracy, just in a Christian form in the Middle East, who saw that really the only way forwards for the island was to try and pursue a kind of non-aligned interest, to not be connected with the Western Bloc, and that his major allies in that were again the leftists, the Agel party. At that point, Kissinger greenlit the Turkish invasion of the north. in cooperation with allowing an attempted coup organized by the Greek junta in the south. So you see exactly the pattern that you are describing, and what happened as a result. People who had always lived in the north or in the south, because there was no greater population of Muslims in the north or the south, are cleaned up, are pushed into one or the other, and then it becomes a problem of zero-sum territorial logic, and it becomes controllable. And that same process has played out in many other parts of the region. It's played out in Lebanon, with the ways in which the communities there have been differentially treated by imperialism, and it is the same thing that is happening now in Syria.
And I mean, I want to explore a bit more around the, particularly the resources element. Some of your work has also focused on the exploitation and circulation of resources as a driver of historical change. And obviously, as many people will know, particularly the extraction or, well, oil reshaped the entire region in the 20th century, right? And oil, particularly, the extraction of resource and particularly oil. And, some have argued that therefore that extraction, that exploitation of resources required undemocratic regimes in place. What does yeah, I guess what does a political economy lens tell us about the Middle East resources, have been almost like such a curse for its people, and seemingly such a gift for, external powers. And we're seeing that play out now with, Trump actually being quite open about it, right? More open than other particularly more open than other US presidents, but actually the actions are basically the same, right? Like, what does that political economy tell us still, over 100 years later?
So, oil in particular, but yes, all of these fossil fuels, including gas in the Eastern Mediterranean, that's a major point of contention that brings the Israeli state squarely into focus. That's where a lot of the genuine competition between the Turkish and Israeli states has come from, is trying to divide up access to gas in the Eastern Mediterranean. But yes, oil in particular. Of course, it's essential, and it's played a determining role in the continued interest of global imperial powers in this region. There are parts of the world that have similar levels of diversity, similar levels of intercommunal conflict, as well as cooperation, strong revolutionary movements that haven't seen the same level of interest, and that is clearly because of the presence of oil there. At the same time, I think it's important that we don't see natural resources and fossil fuels as the actors driving this process in itself. Imperial powers want control of oil and gas because it is the way that they reproduce their own power, which is to say, if they weren't involved or if they focused on other sources of oil, then the potential would be that other powers would take control over those resources and could build up effective forces of resistance. Which, in a way, we kind of saw in Venezuela, the way in which sort of oil sales were used to subsidize genuine experiments in popular democracy and self-governance. Of course, there were contradictions there that the Bolivarian Revolution faced, but here was a clear example of what might happen if imperial powers withdrew from a region because they didn't need that oil. So I think it's clear, it's important that we see the attempt to take these natural resources as a mechanism of control over the populations. And I think this is where political economy as a tradition is slightly departs from the assumptions around economics. In economics, we think about the material itself. Political economy takes a more holistic perspective that keeps the control of people at the center. And that's really what it's about. That within the Middle East, not only do you have these resources, but you also had, as you mentioned in your previous question, the existence of strong movements that could translate control of those resources into a movement and a set of forces that would have the potential to threaten Western Euro-American hegemony in the world.
And I mean, I want to, I do want to get back to particularly some of, particularly the interests of Western powers, let's call it. But, one of the, when we talk about, the region of the Middle East, we're talking about, Syria, Turkey, Cyprus, Palestine, and so on. Particularly the Gulf states are not really spoken about very often. I think it's probably because, Gulf state armies are, very rarely involved in like kind of active, what is called like hot wars in terms of like with, boots on the ground. But I want to ask, particularly as as a historian, where do the Gulf states fit in this picture? And the reason why I'm also asking you this is obviously, many people will know the involvement of like, the Qatari state, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE in, the particularly the past 10 years of Syria, but they also seem to be, seem to be developing more and more ambitions, regional ambitions. So, are they actually involved in this picture with their own ambitions, or are they, because some people do call them this, right? Or are they just mere instruments of a wider imperial order, or both?
I think, well, the short answer is both, but I think the longer answer is it depends on the period that we're in.
Mm.
When the global hegemon, as it's been more or less since 1945, the US, is at a high point of its power, then the ability of sort of sub-hegemonic states, the states that are still powerful, like Turkey, for example, another like Saudi Arabia, they're still powerful, but they don't get to set the rules. That's all that hegemony really means. Who gets to set the rules? And when the hegemonic power, the power that gets to set the rules, is at a high point of its strength, the ability of the people who are underneath and who benefit from the rules but might want them changed a little bit one way or another, their ability to do what they want, their autonomy, is compromised. It's lessened. So that helps to explain, for example, why in the context of the 90s, both Turkey and Israel were at various points essentially told by the US what was going to happen in a given moment. Like bringing the first Intifada to an end, the US wanted it brought to an end because it was causing too much disruption, and so it was brought to an end. We're not in a period, as I think everyone recognizes, we're not in a period of high imperial strength. We're currently in a period where the certainty of who gets to make the rules is no longer clear. And that's why you have a situation where an American president is saying the quiet part out loud. Like, you don't say those kinds of things if you're in control. That's although it's a slightly odd way of looking at it, the necessity of saying we're going into Venezuela and we're going to take all this oil is an expression of the US's relative weakness. If you can do that, you just do it. You don't have to say that you're going to do it. And so in this moment then of relative imperial weakness, the ability of regional actors to start trying to change the rules on the ground is increased. And we see them all trying to do that. And the Gulf states are a perfect example of it. They are testing the boundaries. They're seeing how they can change this or that to their benefit in a moment where potentially the next hegemonic power doesn't, for example, the People's Republic of China, if it doesn't manage to establish itself, doesn't have the same interests, doesn't have the same as the US had, doesn't have the same assumptions about how the region should be ordered. And so whenever that new moment comes about, they will have managed to move the pieces on the board to their own benefit. And I think every regional power is currently doing that. That's exactly what Turkey is doing. That's exactly what Israel is doing. And the Gulf states are just the least obvious examples of it. So, yes, they might have been tools of imperialism, but they always had a relative autonomy. And we saw that in the 70s, for example, with the way that the OPEC states in the 70s controlled the oil price in response to the war in 73. We are now in a moment where the rules of the game are breaking down, and global imperial powers are essentially saying that exact phrase. Like Marco Rubio, when he went to speak at that Munich conference, I think it was this month, maybe it was the end of this February, I think maybe at the end of January. He said the rules are changing and Europe needs to catch up. So everyone is recognizing now the structural crisis the world system is in, or recognizing the public sphere. Of course, they've known that for a lot longer. And so what we see Saudi Arabia doing, what we see Qatar doing, what we see the UAE doing is an expression of that, this period that sometimes gets called an interregnum. That means the period between kings. At the moment, we don't really have a monarch in the world. And so all of the aristocrats are scrabbling to try and get what land they can, what power they can, until the new king emerges. And at that point, the rules will be more fixed again.
And I mean, in response to, what you said about, like Marco Rubio's speech, obviously Trump has been saying similar things like JD Vance and like, the entire US administration, particularly since they came into power, but that was one of their strategies in saying that, in vying for power, right? And it seems that interacting with also obviously 2 years of a genocide in Gaza and other things, Europe really is going through an identity crisis, right? And I say that because obviously there's both the rise of the far right as numbers, but also the rise of the power of the far right, right? And there seems to be a way that Europe doesn't want to lose its relationship with the US, but also doesn't really know how to associate with it. And and that context, and as you said, like the new king hasn't been crowned per se. We also, as we've like touched on a few times, keep hearing about a new Middle East, and some people push for an approach where people should just fall in line and try and get as big a piece of the cake as possible. Or obviously, others are actively trying to kind of, I guess, almost use that as an opportunity to shape it in a different way than it was shaped 100 years ago. But we are seeing, and as you've said, in terms of some of the ways that the Gulf states are also, in the picture as well, alongside some of these usual actors. There are new alliances. There's new maps being shown, by different states all the time. New power brokers. In somewhat unprecedented ways, but also in some ways that resemble, you know, those who like went to the region and just like drew lines in the sand 100 years ago. And as we already spoke about, the peoples being minoritized in this project have deep histories of surviving exactly this, right? And your research spans, from the Mongol world empire, the commercial revolutions that reshaped the Caucasus and the rise and fall of cities like Ani. I know this is a big question, but as a snapshot, what could a 1,000-year view of this region tell us about the so-called new Middle East? And I'm particularly interested in that because, what I want to know is what should we be paying attention to that particularly the headlines miss entirely in the context of this new effort of pushing this, sectarian anti-siblinghood of peoples, of nations.
It's a big but key question, right? Like I think if there's one thing that a long-term perspective, a sort of millennial perspective on the region teaches us, it is that however concrete current realities seem, however unassailable current identities, states, powers appear, they disappear like mirages once the conditions that produced them are no longer around. 1,000 years ago, in 1026, the most powerful state across the territory that is contemporary Turkey was what's referred to as the Byzantine Empire. It was, the inhabitants, though, referred to it as Romania, the land of the Romans, Rum. That state was the most powerful state in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Middle East, whilst from Egypt, its kind of condominium, its co-power, sort of split between them, was a Shia Ismaili caliphate. The people within that state, within Romania, believed very strongly that they were Romans in a sense that we would recognize today as a kind of patriotism. There was a deep trauma to the emergence of the Seljuk Turks coming into the region and the beginnings of the long transformations that would eventually become Turkey. And we would recognize that, and that there's the evidence for this goes on over a century afterwards, we would recognize that as something very familiar, the sense of a deep connection to that ground, to that land. Now, 1,000 years later, some things remain. There are Muslims in the Pontus who say that they speak Romaica, the language of the Romans. But most elements of that robust power are no longer there. And that process has played out again and again and again. What hasn't changed, though, is the continuity of a much slower pace of life on the ground. What a historian called Fernand Braudel, who thought in the long term, so he would have loved your question about a sort of millennial perspective, what he referred to as material civilization, the real basis of life. And that real basis is the ongoing production and reproduction of life as a process of creativity, of remaking and making ourselves and each other in a much more, in a way that escapes the ability of states to make it legible, to make it homogenous. And that also continues today. I want to give a really concrete example. We spoke about the Armenian genocide as in some ways heralding the shape of the 20th century Middle East. It is a moment that is played out again and again. We can enumerate subsequent genocides from Dersim to the Nakba to the Yazidi genocide to many others. It's plagued our region. And within the 20th century, there are many stories that underline this tragedy. There are families who today live in exile, in diaspora, with two sets of keys. One for their house in what they refer to as Western Armenia, Southeast Turkey or North Kurdistan, and another for their house in Palestine. Many survivors of the Armenian genocide went not only to Lebanon, where of course there's still a very large community, but also to Palestine, where they joined a community that's first attested in the 5th century, in the 400s. Some of the earliest examples of Armenian epigraphy, of the Armenian language written down, come from the 400s in Palestine. So on one hand, we could see that as an expression of what's been lost over the 20th century. And yet, as I mentioned, the path of the expulsion of the Armenians went through Serikanye, through Ras Al Ain, to Deir ez-Zor. Many Armenians were lost along the way. Of course, many died, but also many others were variously taken in or, frankly, taken from these trains of Armenians being expelled from what's now Turkey, especially young women. Those young women were attempted to be assimilated by the majority populations in many cases. But in the context of the revolution in North and East Syria, we see how they weren't silent, how the slow pace of material life played out at the level of their families. They spoke to their children, they spoke to their grandchildren about who they were, despite the fact that those children and grandchildren may have been being raised not with no connection in any immediate everyday sense to their Armenianness. They knew on some level that this was within them. They knew that their grandmothers, and it's especially grandmothers who seem to have played a role here, that their grandmothers connected to this history. And so in the context of the revolution in North and East Syria, we see now entirely Muslim, Arabophone, Arabic-speaking communities reclaiming their Armenianness whilst refusing to reject those other aspects of their sense of self that have existed, that have developed since the genocide. Refusing to accept that to be Armenian means you have to be Christian, for example. Refusing to accept a nationalist logic of Armenianness. Now, if that can survive over the last century, at a point where the material power of the states that we have is so much stronger than even the most powerful states 1,000 years ago, the ability to control our lives through education, never forget both Hebrew and modern Turkish are entirely state-produced languages that attempted to sever people from their past before the existence of these states. If even then you have the most minoritized groups, people rejected by Muslims for being Armenians and Armenians for being Muslims, in the right contexts, with the right levels of organization, given the right conditions, an ability to reclaim and rebirth that aspect of their sense of self, then everything remains to play for now. Then there is, and I think that's the ultimate lesson of a historical perspective. There are no final defeats, but also there are no final victories.
Mm. I mean, yeah, I think everything we've discussed today and everything I've heard you say today, it seems like, one of the most important things, particularly right now, is to, go beyond the binary that's being pushed, which is, the binary of what's happening in the region is, ancient hatreds on one side, and it's all about oil on the other. So I guess, finally, to be able to really push beyond that binary, of course, there's many things that many people don't know the answers to, but what might be a good place to start is to start perhaps asking some of the correct questions. Yeah, I guess finally, what questions should people be asking to be able to move beyond that binary?
I think most fundamentally, we need to be asking how we can inhabit and live our identities, our senses of self, without a nation state framework. If there's one thing that has allowed all of the various expressions of imperialist control in this region, it is the nation state form. That's the ultimate way in which that legibility is achieved, both for the actual nation state itself and for global imperial powers, for the Western powers. And that's hard. That's something that I don't pretend will be easy. And we've seen it with the many responses to January, the way in which people instinctively felt, many Kurds instinctively felt, well, this shows that the project to have a multi-ethnic democracy the Brotherhood of Peoples has failed. Now is the time to try for a Kurdish nation state. And I think that would be the wrong answer, that would misunderstand the moment that we're in. Because even if successful, all that would do would start the process again. We should never forget there is some truth to the Kemalist understanding of what happened at the end of the First World War. There was an attempt to do to the Anatolian regions of the Ottoman Empire what was done to the Syrian and Mesopotamian regions of the Ottoman Empire. They did have to fight actively against imperial powers. It was successful. And what has been the history since? There is some truth also to the Zionist claim about the ways in which Jews have been minoritized, the ways in which the creation of this expendable population enabled some of the worst crimes. Crime even feels like too weak a word for all of the things that we know have been done. I've just come back from Berlin recently. The horrors of the Holocaust are unimaginable. And yet, in the creation of the Jewish state, what has it produced? Time and again, we see this same cycle. Mm. And it's only by asking that question, how can we move beyond this trap, that we can actually produce a kind of answer to imperial power. Because as long as we keep coming back to the nation state, all we do is say, here is a perfect context for imperial control. That's why in the meeting in Paris in early January, you had around the table the US government, the Israeli state, representatives of the Israeli state, representatives of the Turkish state, and representatives of the Damascus transitional government, so-called. Because they all knew that their collective interest was the crushing of a project that refused to allow itself to be subordinated to this project.
Thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts, Nick. I really, really appreciate you joining me today. And
thanks so much, Elif.
And that's it for today's episode of the Amargi Mosaic. Until next time, take care.